Every year during Lent, as we approach Holy Week and the story of the crucifixion, we hear this theme of taking up your cross, dying in order to live, or letting go of your life in order to find it. For many of us, it sounds kind of grim and gives us just one more reason to want to get through Lent as fast as we can and on to the season of resurrection. A friend of mine who was a Lutheran pastor and a scholar once pointed out to me that in one of the most famous stories from Zen Buddhism, the Buddha expressed the essence of enlightenment by simply holding up a lotus flower in silence. In contrast, he said, Jesus of Nazareth expressed the essence of salvation by holding up a cross. And your first thought might be, is our faith really that grim? Wouldn't you prefer a lotus flower to a cross? Or is there something else at work here? Where is the meaning, let alone the good news, in all this talk of death and dying and the cross? We already know that our tradition declares us good, made in God's image and loved by God. So this idea of losing your life to find life isn't about being bad or evil. That's not what our tradition says about us. So what is it about? I believe that part of the answer comes from the strand of Christian faith which speaks of the need to be born anew in some way, to live our lives in some new way. The Apostle Paul speaks of this in Romans, where he writes, "Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized were baptized into Christ's death? We have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead, we too might walk in newness of life." Clearly, Paul isn't talking about literal death here, but about a symbolic experience or understanding of death that gives rise to newness of life here and now, newness of life that we can walk in here and now. So what if the whole way of the cross is not simply, as we often think, about suffering for suffering's sake or self-abnegation? What if it is about finding new life, even finding joy? Last week I talked about the ways we are unconsciously colonized by oppressive social patterns of thought and behavior like consumerism, individualism, racism, sexism, winning at all costs, the myth of redemptive violence, and so on. We come to think of ourselves and to act in ways that are dictated by these outer forces rather than by our own inner freedom to choose what is truly life-giving for us. In other words, we construct a false sense of self based on these kinds of social demands, as well as our own tendencies to feed the endless desires and demands of the ego. But is that any way to live? In bondage to a false image of ourselves based on the petty needs of our egos or the demands of our social setting? The great Christian mystic and social critic Thomas Merton talked about this a long time ago in his book, New Seeds of Contemplation. And he started by saying, a tree gives glory to God simply by being a tree. Rocks and mountains, animals and flowers, and all nature do the same. For example, the special, clumsy beauty of a particular colt on a particular April day in a particular field is a kind of holiness offered to God. The pale flowers of the dogwood outside this window are saints. This leaf has its own texture and its own pattern of veins and its own holy shape. The great, gashed, half-naked mountain is another of God's saints. There is no other like him. Nothing else in the world ever did or ever will imitate God in quite the same way. Isn't that part of what we love about animals? They may be driven by survival instincts, but they aren't driven by ego. There is an isness about them that is refreshing to our ego-driven, socially contrived selves. They are what they are without pretense, without the need to prove anything to anyone, least of all themselves. But what about you? What about me? Merton continues. For me to be a saint means to be myself too. Trees and animals have no problem with this, but with us it's different. God leaves us free to be whatever we like. We can be ourselves or not.